Something about Halloween fascinates so many of us. Maybe it's the anticipation of being scared or the allure of pretending to be someone else for a night, or maybe it's simply the celebration. But behind the masks and the costume parties, you feel this underlying threat. It's like a steady, quiet pulse. You try to keep at the back of your mind, but eventually it rises to the surface, and suddenly the shadows come alive and danger feels imminent. Perhaps that pulse is a reminder that the real monsters walk amongst us every day and that they aren't wearing costumes. Many believe 21-year-old Chris Jenkins, a senior at the University of Minnesota, encountered the very worst humanity had to offer on Halloween night in 2002. For years, police believed Chris's death was an accident, or even that he took his own life. But his family relentlessly pursued the truth, believing he was not only murdered, but that Chris was possibly one of many victims in a string of killings known as the Smiley Face Murders. Please join me in welcoming my friend, collaborator, and fellow horror YouTuber Rob Dyke as we present this tragically unsolved murder to you. Today on Dark Matters, the mysterious death of Chris Jenkins.
Throughout Chris's life, friends and family knew him to be outgoing, happy, adventurous, and popular, but he was far from typical. Chris was always fearlessly himself, even if that meant going against the crowd. While attending the University of Minnesota for his business degree, he maintained a near-perfect grade point average, all while captaining the school's lacrosse team as the goalie. In fall of 2002, Chris was close to graduation, and by the time October came around, he already had several job interviews lined up and was looking forward to his future endeavors. With so much on his plate, Halloween night was the perfect opportunity for Chris to take a break from the pressures of school. So, dressed in a Native American costume, he set out with a group of his friends for a night of celebration and drinking. After leaving a keg party, Chris's group found themselves in downtown Minneapolis at the Lone Tree Bar and Grill at around 10:30 p.m. At some point during the night, Chris spilled his drink on his pants, and a little after midnight, an off-duty police officer working security at the bar noticed the spill. Thinking Chris had urinated himself, the officer threw Chris out of the bar, telling the bouncer at the door that the white guy dressed as an Indian was not allowed back inside. Chris stood outside in the bitter cold, heavily intoxicated, without his wallet, coat, phone, or keys, and with nowhere to go. At this point, it is believed he began walking home while still heavily intoxicated. But by the morning, Chris was nowhere to be found.
The morning of November 1st was a waking nightmare for the Jenkins family. Police told them Chris hadn't been seen since the night before, and they speculated he'd walked towards his apartment via the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, which crosses the Mississippi River, before deciding to stay somewhere else for the night. But immediately this didn't sit right with Chris's mother, Jan Jenkins. She knew that if her son spent the night anywhere other than his apartment, he would have at least told a friend, and none of his friends had any idea where he was. So Jan organized a search party herself. Everyone from family, friends, classmates, to students on rival lacrosse teams showed up to aid in the search. Downtown and the nearby bridges were canvassed multiple times, and you could hardly walk 5 feet without seeing Chris's missing poster. But no one had any leads, including the Minneapolis Police Department. Right away, the Jenkins family felt that the Minneapolis PD and the FBI weren't taking the case seriously, so they took matters into their own hands and hired professional private investigator Chuck Lesh. Chuck first obtained videos from the Hennepin Avenue Bridge's surveillance cameras to determine if Chris had actually crossed the bridge that night, as police speculated. But he was nowhere to be seen the night of the 31st or the following day, and the surveillance operator said it would be impossible to cross the entire 1,000-foot length of the bridge without being seen. So Lesh tried gathering surveillance from other CCTV cameras near where Chris had disappeared, but he had no luck there either, leaving investigators with no video evidence whatsoever. It was also Lesh, and not police, who interviewed a majority of witnesses to see if anyone could provide any more crucial information. And he found out that several people who had been in the area that night witnessed a gang of at least 10 men attacking another man right outside the Times Square Pizza and Subs restaurant, which sat diagonally across the street from the Lone Tree Bar. However, the exact time the fight occurred couldn't be determined, but the Jenkins family wasn't deterred by the lack of evidence or the lack of police aid. They personally hired and paid for highly qualified canine units to help with the search, dogs that had previously located the bodies of missing people within 5 minutes. On November 7th and November 8th, 2 separate hounds follow a trail of Chris's scent from the Lone Tree Bar to the front of Times Square Pizza and into a nearby parking garage where it ends at parking stalls 89 and 90. There, authorities find bits of red string and feather, which possibly came from Chris's costume, along with blood residue, but that evidence was discarded by police before it could be tested. Keep in mind, Chris had no reason to be in the parking garage that night. The friend who'd driven him downtown parked on the side of the road just outside the Lone Tree, nowhere near the garage. Investigators theorized that Chris was transported away in a vehicle that was parked in one of those stalls. A month later, on December 9th, the canine units go out again and follow Chris's scent from parking stalls 89 and 90, out into traffic as if trailing a car, out of downtown, and 4.4 miles later, the scent trail finally ends on the northbound ramp of Interstate 94. This furthered the theory that Chris was transported elsewhere that night by car. The canine units also searched the banks of the Mississippi River and under the downtown bridges multiple times, but even with several hits, there were no signs of Chris. So whoever had parked in stalls 89 or 90 that night possibly transported Chris to I-94 North. Parking records show that that space had been occupied Halloween night by one of the bouncers from the Lone Tree Bar. It was unclear if this bouncer was the same off-duty officer that threw Chris out of the bar, but canine units did get a mild hit for Chris's scent off of the car in question. However, it seems there was no follow-up conducted with this individual. Investigators hit a dead end, and months would pass before the next clue rose to the surface.
On February 27, 2003, a passerby on the 3rd Avenue Bridge looks down into the recently thawed waters of the Mississippi River, and he sees a body caught on tree branches. Police arrive, and within minutes they confirm the body is Chris Jenkins. Police theorize that Chris had accidentally fallen or purposefully jumped from the Hennepin Bridge on Halloween night and had been in the water for the 118 days following. The initial autopsy agreed, labeling Chris's death as an accidental drowning. The Jenkins family was outraged by this, as Chris had no history of depression and had been looking forward to his future outside of school, but the family didn't have to look far to find evidence that his death had been no accident. Chris was found still fully clothed in his Halloween costume with his shirt still tucked in. He was still wearing his slip-on shoes and one ring on each index finger. Either the water currents or a jump from the bridge would have likely dislodged his clothing and jewelry. Chris also had none of the injuries expected with a fall off of a bridge. He had no bruises or broken bones, but according to friends and family, Chris's legs were normally covered with bruises, the result of playing lacrosse. His last practice took place 2 days before he disappeared, so if he'd been in the water since the night he went missing, he would have still had the bruises. This told the family he'd been alive after going missing, at least long enough for the bruises to heal. Chris's body was also found with clumps of long blonde hair clenched in his fists. At first, investigators thought it was Chris's own hair, but the DNA comparison was done incorrectly, and it could not be conclusively said that the hair belonged to Chris. However, it did not match the hair on his head, and appeared to have been placed in his hands post-mortem. The autopsy also revealed that Chris's blood alcohol level would have been approximately 0.06 at the time of his death. The strangest revelation, though, was that the weight of his lungs combined equaled approximately half the weight of one normal healthy lung. Considering he was an athlete, the coroner found this very telling and alarming. But even with these findings, it wasn't until 2006, when a new Minneapolis PD chief was appointed, that Chris's case was reclassified as a homicide and reopened for investigation. That same year, a prisoner who was incarcerated for murder confessed he'd witnessed Chris be thrown over the Hennepin Bridge by an acquaintance of his. However, this lacked both evidential and circumstantial credence, as it is nearly impossible to be thrown off of the Hennepin. One would have needed to lift Chris, a nearly 200-pound athlete, over the high safety railing and throw him outwards 4 to 5 feet over a steel beam, all while avoiding vertical metal cables and without being seen by traffic or security cameras. It's a feat nearly impossible for two men, much less one, so police dropped their investigation of the inmate in 2007.
We already know that Chris's death was an accident, and that police's theory of an accidental drowning was an erroneous conclusion. But the waters of the Mississippi also tell us that A, Chris did not die the night of his disappearance, B, that he was not in the water the entire time he was missing, and C, that the death Chris suffered was cruel and calculated. Here's what the experts were able to tell us about Chris's death. Hydrologists at the University of Minnesota who profile every aspect of the Mississippi River concluded Chris's body had entered the water a mile away from where he'd been found, far out of the downtown area and away from the Hennepin and 3rd Avenue bridges. Renowned forensic pathologist Dr. Michael Baden said that Chris's body position was not consistent with drowning victims, who are nearly always found face down, arms out at their sides, head tucked down towards their chin, and normally their clothing is disheveled and shoes are missing. Chris was floating face up, on his back, all his jewelry, shoes, and clothing intact and undisturbed, his head tilted to the right. His arms were crossed in front of his abdomen, his fists clenched over one another, similar to how Egyptian mummies were positioned post-death. Also, the night he went missing, the Mississippi was frozen over and remained that way until the first thaw, which wasn't until January 31st, 2003. If he'd been thrown over the bridge, his body would have been seen almost immediately. Chris's body also had insects burrowed under the skin, insects that could not have survived outdoors or in the water during the Minnesota winter, meaning his body was indoors for a time after his death. He was then dumped on the riverbank where his left half was submerged in the water while his right was exposed to the air for approximately 36 to 48 hours. This explains why his right hand was further desiccated than his left and why his left side was encased in ice, which occurred when the river froze over again. Forensic experts Kevin Gannon and Lee Gilbertson believe Chris's body was fully swept into the water during the 3rd thaw, which began on February 27th, the same day his body was discovered. All of this confirms that Chris hadn't been in the water from the time he went missing to when his body was discovered, and that his body was deliberately placed in the water after his death. But even so, we still don't know who is responsible. There are a number of theories, but perhaps the most chilling is that Chris was only one of many victims, not of a serial killer, but of an entire group of them.
Since the 1990s, there's been a string of suspiciously similar deaths amongst college-aged men. Most of the victims have been popular, athletic, and intelligent, and nearly all of them disappeared after a night of drinking and partying, before turning up dead in a body of water. And all of them were ruled accidental drownings, except for two, Chris Jenkins and Patrick McNeil, whose case was eerily similar to Chris's. Patrick, a former student at Fordham University in New York, disappeared one night in 1997 after leaving a bar. Months later, he washed up dead in the East River. He too was found face up, had insects burrowed under his skin, and was only in the water for a day when he was discovered. He died from strangulation. The victims span a large geographic area, 11 states and 25 cities, but a majority of them were attending colleges near the I-94 corridor in the Midwest, including Chris Jenkins, which is part of the reason why former New York detectives Kevin Gannon and Anthony Duarte believe Chris was the victim of a murderous conglomerate they've nicknamed the Smiley Face Gang. The moniker stems from the graffiti smiley faces found near the bodies of over a dozen of the 45 men that are thought to have been murdered by this gang. The detectives believe it is the killer's way of leaving their mark on the murder. If this group exists, their motives are still unknown, but Duarte and Gannon believe they follow a pattern: drugging male college students before capturing them and murdering them, then attempting to make it look like an accidental drowning. But not everyone agrees that this gang even exists at all. In Chris's case, the Minneapolis PD and the FBI both refused to confirm or endorse the smiley face murders theory and claim that no solid connections between the deaths exist. But Duarte and Gannon worry that the killings will continue if no major investigating body acknowledges evidence suggesting that the smiley face gang is very real and very dangerous. Jan Jenkins asked police whether or not a smiley face was found near Chris's body. She says she received no verbal confirmation, but she personally felt the way the officers reacted to the question that the answer was, more likely than not, yes.
So regardless of who committed the murder, what do experts, investigators, and family believe happened to Chris when he disappeared on Halloween in 2002? And how did he die if he didn't drown and had no signs of outward injury? They theorize that on the night of Halloween, Chris unknowingly ingested a date rape drug, which was untraceable post-mortem. His change in behavior would have gone unnoticed as the effects of date rape drugs mirror extreme intoxication. Then, after being kicked out of the bar, he was forcibly taken into the parking garage, where he was abducted into a car near stalls 89 and 90, after which the vehicle headed north on I-94. Then it is thought he was held at an unknown indoor location, possibly being kept complacent with more drugs before being killed. Those involved in the investigation believe Chris was suffocated, as evidenced by the light weight of his lungs post-mortem. But there was no sign of strangulation or traditional suffocation, so how was he killed? Slowly is the unfortunate answer. He was likely in a drug-induced state while being slowly deprived of oxygen, and one theory is that his killers tied a plastic bag over his head while he was sedated and let his body slowly shut down from the lack of oxygen. Having drugged him and suffocated him without any signs of a struggle, all his killers needed was to throw him in the water to make it look like an accident. And despite initial police error, it is now clear that Chris Jenkins was the victim of a very deliberate, calculated, and cunning murder committed by unknown persons. And unfortunately, as of right now in 2016, it seems that the Minneapolis PD has made no further investigation since 2006. So true justice still remains at large, along with Chris's killer.
Since his death, family and friends have tried to keep Chris's memory alive as best they can. Chris's university hosts an invitational lacrosse game in his honor, and in 2009, Jenkins published a book called Footprints of Courage, detailing the entire investigation from her point of view. She says that despite all of the frustration, the family has built a working relationship with the police, all for the sake of finding out the truth behind Chris's murder, which to this very day remains unsolved.
So no matter what you choose to believe or what you speculate, I ask you only for respect in the comments. And again, if you have any more information, the contact info for the investigating bodies can be found in the description, along with sources used for this video. Also, if you haven't already, I would really appreciate it if you guys would head on over to Rob's channel and check out his newest episode of Twisted Tens, where we tell you about 10 horrific Halloween tragedies, some of which remain unsolved to this day as well. And remember, while these may be dark matters, the darkness always matters. Special thanks to my friend Rob for helping me present this incredibly tragic and complex case to you. Be sure to click on the top video over there or follow the link in the description, which will take you to the second half of this collaboration on his channel, where we talk about 10 horrific Halloween tragedies. And of course, if you want to see more videos or have a request for a case you want me to cover, hit that subscribe button and leave a comment telling me what you'd like to see. However, if you're looking for something on the lighter side, you can check out Rob Dyke's new revamped podcast, which I co-host on. The Bitter Pill podcast, which just launched its first episode, so be sure to go out there and check that out as well. Link for that one is in the description. Thank you guys for watching to the end of the video. I will see you in the next one. Stay safe, friends, and have a good night.